Welcome to Michael Potts F1, everything Formula 1, but from a photographer's point of view. Round 3, the Australian Grand Prix in Melbourne, and probably the most beautiful paddock in all of Formula 1.
This was my first Australian Grand Prix, and I must say it was a great race, and I would highly recommend that you put this race high on your list of Grand Prix to attend. There were over 450,000 people attending the 4 days of the race weekend. That makes it the third highest attended race of all time. That's behind last year's British Grand Prix and the 1996 Adelaide race. Despite so many people attending, the organisers still delivered an amazing fan experience. There is the famous Melbourne Walk, which is fairly unique at races. Here, fans line up to see their heroes and hopefully get an autograph or a selfie. It's a very festive experience. There's a DJ, massive heads of the drivers floating around, and loads of fans dressed up supporting their favourite teams and drivers. If you would like to get a spot in the front row, it means queuing for hours outside the gates before they open. I heard stories of people queuing from 1 AM on race day. But being first in the queue is no guarantee. You also need to sprint a considerable distance from the gate to the walk to grab your prime spot. Despite it being on a massive scale, the event still feels very cosy. The paddock is one of the most beautiful ones we go to, with these beautiful trees providing shade. There's also a very old school feeling about the pit building, which I think is quite beautiful. The track itself weaves its way around a city park, making for a very beautiful backdrop. It was quite refreshing having a day race for a change. This was our first one since Brazil last year. It did rain briefly early on Saturday morning, but other than that, the weather was spectacular. When we arrived at the paddock on Thursday, everyone was very curious to see what the developments would be at scandal-ridden Red Bull, and what was the latest fallout following the dismissal of Christian Horner's allegations. We did see a very united team. Christian and Max spent some time together chatting, and everything appeared to be back to normal. We went through the whole weekend without any bombshells being dropped. And while the team management appears to have repaired things off the track, they surprisingly struggled on track. Red Bull didn't top any of the practice sessions, and Ferrari and McLaren appeared to be very strong. This was surprising after Red Bull had been so dominant in the first 2 races. Normal service, however, resumed in qualifying, with Max taking pole from Sainz and Perez. But a 3-place penalty for Perez put him down the grid at the start. When Max pulled away at the lead of the race, we'd all resigned ourselves to the inevitable. But then the unthinkable happened. Carlos managed to overtake Max using DRS, and the crowd went wild. This was almost a home race for Ferrari, as there are so many Italian expats living in Australia. This is probably one of the reasons why the coffee is so good here. The crowd then went into raptures when smoke came out the back of Max's car, and he was forced to retire early in the race. This was Max's first retirement since the Australian Grand Prix in 2022. That level of reliability is remarkable. In all those 44 races, he has won 35 of them, only not being on the podium in 4 events. And this was the only time he hasn't scored points. There has never been anything like that in Formula 1 history. We all left wondering what this poor result will have on the fragile peace at Red Bull. While Perez didn't have a great race, his heir apparent Daniel Ricciardo probably had a worse one. Seeing his teammate get into Q3 in qualifying and then a handsome 7th place in the race, Daniel was only able to manage 12th. On Thursday, I was in quite an awkward press conference with Daniel and Checo, and it couldn't have been comfortable for Checo hearing Daniel being so blatantly linked with his race seat. But after this weekend, the pressure is really on both drivers to try and succeed. The other Aussie, by contrast, had a great home race. But things could have been better. Oscar was in 3rd place when the team asked him to move aside for Lando, who was on fresher tyres. Oscar was the perfect team player, and while the local crowd was robbed of a podium, this was still joint best result by an Australian at their home race. In all honesty, Lando probably would have overtaken him because of the better tyre advantage anyway. This podium does give Lando a dubious record. He is now the driver to have scored the most podiums without a race win. McLaren is hugely popular in Melbourne, as you'd expect, and papaya has really become the dominant shade of orange in the past few races. It wasn't that good a race weekend over at McLaren's engine provider, Mercedes. The Works team looked off the pace compared to its customer teams, with Lewis Hamilton particularly having a dismal time. He was out in Q2 in qualifying, and then had engine failure during the race. George was going a lot better in the race until a huge crash on the final lap, caused by Alonso ahead of him suddenly braking. Alonso was penalised 20 seconds for erratic driving, but this now means that George has crashed every single time Carlos has won a race. Alex Albon also crashed his car at the exact same corner, turn 6, but his was in practice. It was a huge crash, and unfortunately the team did not have enough spare parts to repair it. So they took the unprecedented step, well, unprecedented in modern times, to give Alex Logan's car. But this meant that Logan was a bystander, and Australia is an awful long way to travel to compete in 2 practice sessions. The team did believe that Alex would be the most likely driver to score points if any were on offer, and their plan came so close to working. Alex finished 11th and nearly claimed 1 point with a typically brilliant defensive drive trying to stop Kevin Magnussen. Unfortunately for Williams, the Haas driver got his man. And that gave Haas an unlikely double points finish. After their brilliant teamwork in Jeddah, both cars scored in Melbourne, with Nico Hülkenberg taking 9th place. This is remarkable as both cars were in the last 5 during the opening lap. For a team that thought they were going to be dead last, things are working phenomenally well at Haas. As they are at Ferrari. It's debatable if Ferrari would have won had Max not retired. It definitely would have been close. There is a theory going around that Ferrari are kinder on their tyres on tracks where there's more stress on the front tyres, or tracks that are front limited, and Red Bull are better on tracks where the rear tyres wear more. Long, fast corners, like we have at Albon Park, put a lot of stress on the front tyres, as lateral forces and continual steering damage the tyres. So the front tyres wear out quicker than the rear ones, hence the track being front limited. Rear limited circuits are usually ones with slow corners, such as 90-degree corners or hairpins, and that requires the driver to brake hard and then accelerate hard out of the corner. Formula 1 cars are rear-wheel drives, so when the car needs to brake and accelerate, it produces a lot of wear on the rear tyres. Bahrain would be a good example of this. Jeddah would be classed as a front-limited track, but because the tarmac is so smooth, tyre degradation isn't really an issue. In Australia it was. Everyone needed 2 pit stops. Now, to see if this theory holds, watch how things develop over the next 2 races. Japan is front-limited, and it's usually a 2-stop race, with lots of fast corners that would suit both the Ferrari and the McLarens. Shanghai's unique corners also are brutal on the front tyres. Anyway, that's a theory, let's see what happens. One thing we do know is that Carlos Sainz's win was another epic, and he's developing a bit of a habit of winning amazing races. At the 2022 British Grand Prix, he won a very chaotic race, pulling off the perfect safety car strategy. And in Singapore last year, it was a hot, high-speed chess game, showing his amazing tactical nous, slowing down just enough to give Lando Norris a tow to keep him as a buffer from the fast-paced Mercedes cars. This win was an epic on another scale completely. If you remember, Carlos didn't race in Jeddah because he had an emergency appendix operation. In less than 2 weeks, he was back in a Formula 1 car. Now, I remember having my appendix out, and I wasn't allowed to lift anything for a month. Carlos had a seat check on Thursday, and he looked awful. I didn't think there'd be any possibility that he could race. On Friday practice, he virtually crawled into his car. I've never seen a driver enter a car so gingerly before. And even after the race, when he won, you could see he wasn't moving freely. But his celebrations after the race were such a release. He's been through so much over the past few weeks. Hearing that he's lost his drive at Ferrari, this appears to have motivated him to excel. He's outraced Leclerc in both Bahrain and Australia, and he's putting forward a massive case for him to get a good drive next year. I was next to his father as he celebrated his win, and it was such a lovely moment between the two of them. The Ferrari celebrations are always brilliant. There's lots of champagne being sprayed everywhere, and I must say, it's much better to be covered in champagne than sticky Red Bull energy drinks.
No need to ask, is a smooth operator. Smooth
Thank you so much for joining me for the Australian Grand Prix. I really do hope you enjoyed it. Next stop, Japan. So until then, goodbye.